Alrighty, we're on the Ravens Chronicle podcast today. We're gonna have Dr. Megan McElheran. I probably screw up her name, but I will have Jason sing her name properly in 2 seconds. Stay tuned. It's a very good episode where we're gonna talk about mental health. We're gonna talk about plant medicine. We're gonna ask those funny questions that we think that the doctors should probably answer us just by curiosity and so on. Uh, please stay tuned. It's a fantastic one.
Welcome back to the Raven Chronicles with Muninn and Huginn, and today we have Dr. Megan McElheran. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope I didn't butcher your name because I've been practicing it for 1 minute. So
No, that was perfect. You did awesome, and yeah, thanks for having me. This is so fun. I'm glad we were able to connect. Yeah.
So just a quick one for people listening. Megan, as we would honor her pedigree, but Megan has asked us to call her by her first name, so we'll do that. You have a really interesting pedigree because you got your start after the Iraqi war in dealing with soldiers that were coming back and returning from Operation Iraqi Freedom. And that must have really got you deep into the weeds with TBI and PTSD and soldiers coming back very mentally unwell. So would you give us just a quick rundown of who you are, what you're doing, and then sort of a brief history of that and how that kind of sparked you and got you started?
Yeah, for sure. That's going to take me a second because it's been 20-ish years now.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. So I was raised in Calgary and did my undergrad degree here, and shortly after graduating with an undergrad degree, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a psychologist. So I thought I should get some, real life experience and what have you, which brought me into working with people who had experienced a lot of trauma in the first job I had. And I was really hooked. I was really compelled by how people could go through such incredible adversity and incredible traumatic events and be able to recover. And so that really set me on a path where I was like, I want to become a psychologist. And I was really fortunate to get into a consortium program in California that was between Palo Alto and Stanford universities. And so I got to move to the Bay Area and live in this beautiful part of California. And I was really interested in learning more about how people recover from trauma, how we can help people with that experience. And that led me into working in the United States Veterans Affairs System at the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder in Menlo Park. And as you mentioned, like this was a really interesting time because there was still a lot of Vietnam veterans who were coming to the VA for help, but tremendous numbers of active duty military members who were coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan, because I was there during Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom. And so men and women both, tons of military sexual trauma, combat trauma. And I was working in residential treatment programs where people were coming for like 90 days just to work on PTSD symptoms and try to recover from all they'd seen at war or during the war. And I mean, I was just hooked, the stories that people were sharing and the courage and the acts of heroism and the fact, I mean, the thing that has always kept me captivated by this work is that it's almost like to some extent, doesn't matter what people go through. There's this incredible drive people have to move through and transform and reclaim their lives, hard and messy and difficult as that can be. And I just saw that in spades with all of these service members that I was working with, and I worked in the VA system for like 5 or 6 years. And it was just story after story after story. And so I was like, this is it for me. So I spent all that time solely working with soldiers and veterans, came back to Canada, and then shifted that to the Canadian context, working at the Operational Stress Injury Clinic in Calgary. I worked there for a couple of years. And so again, a little bit further beyond our departure from Afghanistan, but primarily working with soldiers who had been in Afghanistan, as well as RCMP members. And then for a variety of reasons, I went into independent practice in the community here in Calgary in 2011. And it was just me. I hung up a shingle and was like, let's see what happens. And some things happened. So I got to know lots of our municipal service folks, started working with Calgary Police and the firefighting department and emergency medical services and corrections, and still working with RCMP and military and veterans. And the practice grew from me in 2011 to where we are now in 2024, where we have a practice in Calgary, Red Deer, Edmonton, and Toronto. And I don't know, there's something like 90 people who now work in the clinics, which is,
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and that's just people coming together, I think, really united in this desire to serve people who serve, and again, I think people have shared this sort of being really compelled by trying to help people who are so devoted themselves to helping other people. There's something really powerful and profound, I think, about being in that space. So that's me in 20 years or less, and
in 2 minutes. well done. That was pretty good.
I'll say it before he says it. Thank you for what you do, because I think our community does need people who understand the trauma, right? Because that's what we talked quickly before starting to record. It's not every psychologist who have the tools to actually talk to people like us, or are not ready to hear what we have to say.
Right.
I cut you off, Jay. You were going to say something?
No, I was smiling because you took the words out of my mouth in the big thank you. But John, I think behind the scenes before we recorded, we're going to try and really revolve the conversation around PTSD. That is so front and center in emergency services. And, we hear about it all the time. You turn on the news, and once a week in Canada, you're hearing about another person in emergency services who has taken their life or, succumbed to these injuries. And there's got to be a way. There's got to be a solution to this, and I don't really know what the answer is, because we're just sort of like at the cusp of the greater community actually understanding that this is real, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe you could speak to that. Where do you think we are in Canada? Like, are we making headway in the greater community understanding that mental health trauma and PTSD is actually a real thing and not just extra sick days?
Yeah, I mean, unequivocally, I'll say yes, we're making headway for sure. If I look at, if I even just go from when I came back to Canada to now, and even if I look at 2015 to now, I see tremendous change that's occurred. It's not linear, right? It's up and down and it bounces. But, not that long ago, so let's say within the last 5 to 10 years, if I was asked to come and give a talk, about 5 or 10 years ago, it was very much about like, come define this problem. What is this problem we're facing? Why is this, why are people going off sick? Why are people ending their lives? Like, why is this happening? And so I would go and I would talk about, well, here's trauma and here's what's happening and here's why we think people are getting injured in this way, And that's shifted in the last few years. People don't want me to come and talk about that anymore. They want me to come and talk about, well, what do we do about it? And, very much like, give us the solutions, give us the strategies, which is unfortunately not that easy to do, but it has shifted. The conversation and the desire for information has shifted. But what I always say, we're looking at changing culture. And we're talking about organizational culture, and we're talking about military and service culture, which has really deep and entrenched roots in doing things a certain way. And so culture change takes time, right? And you can oftentimes only move as quickly as the lowest common denominator is prepared to move, right? And so we get people who are like you guys, right? Bought in, understand it, see it, think it, speak it. And you're collecting people who are joining you and going, yeah, these guys get it, and thank God. And I think we're seeing that across the country, really in droves. But we can only move as quickly as the person who's the least prepared to change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I'm curious of a few things. Do you see someone to empty your baggage? Because I mean, if you hear constantly, like throughout the week, trauma, right? If we have issue carrying our own trauma as a psychologist, do you empty your bucket at the end of the week or at the end of the month or whatever that is?
Yes, I do. I try to do, like, not just do what I say or
lead by example.
Thing goes. Yeah, I try to practice what I preach. So, and I have to be like, I'm pretty rigid or disciplined, I guess, around the things that I do to take care of myself, which, you know, includes prioritizing sleep and hydration and food and good relationships and exercise and all the things, right? But yeah, I mean, I took a couple months off this summer just to, like, I was really burnt out. I took a couple months off just to try to fill myself back up. So for sure, you know, like, I think, you know, I certainly, like, I don't see myself obviously as a first responder, but I think, you know, myself and my colleagues, I mean, we're surrounding, you know, a group of people in this country and beyond who are heavily exposed to stress and trauma, and that, you know, absolutely we absorb that, and that carries over. So we can't continue to help if we don't take care of ourselves, right? It's the same thing that I tell my clients, right? Like, you know, this notion that you're being selfish and taking care of yourself, we really have to disrupt that mindset. So yeah, no, I don't, I can't, if I let my own care of myself diminish, like, it shows up in me within a matter of weeks, for sure.
Yeah. And you know, that literally speaks to one of the main problems that we have in the emergency services, is that so often, and John and I have spoken to this on a couple podcast episodes, almost everybody in the community in the emergency service, or anybody who's a service person, they have a big heart and they really want to help, except they forget to help themselves.
Yep.
And then there's a diminishing return on the investment for the employer and for the community that you're serving, or the country that you're serving, because you know, when you go downhill, then your ability to serve goes downhill. So I'm glad to hear that you're practicing what you preach, because without that, the trauma team around you, you're a trauma team. You're coming to help the servicemen and women, and without you being able to care for yourself, there would be a diminishing return right there, and it just keeps going upstream farther and farther until you get what we currently have, which is amazing men and women who fail to or ignore their own signs and symptoms that they need to take care of themselves.
Yeah, totally. You know, and there's so, I mean, I still see, like, on the topic of have things changed, I mean, I still see from an individual basis, we're still trying to chip away at that notion, right? Because I think, Jay, what you just said, I mean, the way I frame it is that empathy is a risk factor, right? Like, find me someone who didn't enter service work of whatever kind, who wasn't driven by a desire to be helpful and because they cared about other people and, you know, they wanted to be of service to their communities or whatever. So that caring is like an essential ingredient that goes into being able and prepared and willing to do these jobs. But it's not a risk-free exercise, right? Caring comes at a cost. And so if you don't recognize that and then, you know, build and develop ways to monitor and manage how you care, we are all at risk of setting ourselves up to be really disadvantaged.
Yeah, that's well said. Sorry, John, go with your question and then I'll.
What is your take on plant medicine? I mean, we talked in the past to various friends.
Like yeah, finally.
Let's get into it. All right.
Here we go.
No foreplay. We're just going straight into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Seriously, buy me dinner, really.
Yeah,
language barrier right there, right? I don't explain my stuff properly. So, I mean, you where you work in the past, I've been there. I've been given an amount of pills X, Y, Z by all means. There've been trials, and I'm sure, Jay, you've been sitting in the same place where you had to trial a bunch of medication at one point. Now we're seeing something that is coming back. We've always been, right? Since, like, the medication has been there for since 200 years, give or take. But plant medicine has been there for XYZ. Yeah. So we had friends who just came back from Peru who were in I cannot say it properly.
Ayahuasca.
Thank you. See my hot potato here. It doesn't work. And they have awesome outcome of it. So from a person who run her own clinic, I mean, you created BOS, which we're going to speak soon enough about, which you've been with our community for so long. What is your take on this?
Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but up until last spring, I guess, we were offering ketamine treatment within Wayfound in Calgary and Edmonton. Now, we ended up having to, unfortunately, make some decisions to step away from that mostly because it's very difficult right now to be offering that kind of treatment in an outpatient community-based system. It still is most with the regulatory circumstances and kind of how it has to be prescribed and administered. It is still kind of best administered in a hospital setting or in more of a medical type of setting. So we've taken a step back. There are a few clinics in Calgary that we're still referring to and doing some work with. It's also one of the requirements is that it be overseen by a psychiatrist who can be the sort of clinical director, medical director, and psychiatrists are just really hard. There's not enough psychiatrists to begin with, and then to find psychiatrists who have specialty in plant medicine becomes even more difficult. So, I am all for innovation, and I'm certainly all for innovation in particularly pharmacotherapy. And I've had some of my own clients who have received ketamine treatment specifically, and it's been really remarkable in terms of how it's helped them. I think we're going to see MDMA probably be the next prescribable psychedelic, right? So I'm for plant medicine. I also think there's a lot of we have a tendency to be really to be zealots for things that are new and potentially show a lot of promise, which I think is important, and that really drives people's motivation and momentum to keep this kind of thing going. And they're not without risk, right? And sadly, I think we see what happened with Matthew Perry, right? With ketamine as an example of, we do still have to be really mindful that these are potent medicines. As much as they're plant medicines, they're still potent. And to use them for folks who are struggling with psychological injuries or mental health symptoms or what have you, we just have to have a good dose of safety and conscientiousness. And so my only worry is the zealousness can sometimes get people to take shortcuts or miss a couple steps. And I think if we do that, the risk we run is that there's going to be setbacks. So my hope is that we can just keep step by step moving this forward, continue gathering the data, continuing to work with the regulators, and ultimately, hopefully make these things broadly available to people in any number of settings.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I have a tendency to agree with you that I don't think that you should be able to get a prescription for MDMA or
Right.
for ketamine, because the fear is that it'll become a recreational enjoyment.
Right.
And I'll just tell you personally, I have used psilocybin and MDMA and DMT not for recreation, but for my own personal ceremonial therapy, because it's not available in Ontario, and my employer and WSIB in Ontario does not recognize plant medicine as something that would be covered or as a form of therapy. So sadly, you have to go and reach out to places that offer it, outside of your jurisdiction in order to use them.
Yeah.
And the effects have been profound. It has really helped my treatment, and it has really increased my ability to connect with myself and connect with the treatment. So to see, and I think that it's going to have to be that way. I don't think that the public will allow you to go to the pharmacy and go get 20 tabs of MDMA and then go and do your own therapy. So I think that that's right on the mark with what plant medicine should be in the future, is built right into a therapeutic formula.
For sure, right? And I think it would be such a shame if the psychedelics and the plant medicines started to be treated like that, where you could just go and do it by yourself in your home, because they are, MDMA is an empathogen, right? Like, it's intended to help you connect with yourself and with other people. And I think, there's, I think, a degree of concern that a lot of people have, and that I share right now, about the medicalization of plant medicine, right? Like bringing into doctors' offices and hospitals and what have you. I mean, these are things from the earth and have been for since ancient times. But, if that's a way that supports more acceptability and dissemination of these medicines, right? And then there can be communities, and it's done in ceremony, and, there's a real role for psychology and therapy in that. I mean, I hope that that's where we're going to be heading. Like, I hope that, in the next number of years, that's what we'll see. Because that's what I've heard from people too, is that they've been profoundly helped. And frankly, I have done a ton of training. I have worked really hard. I do my absolute best with the clients that I have. There's just sometimes there's such scar tissue around these trauma related injuries that like talk therapy just can't get there, and that's where I've really appreciated things like ketamine and psilocybin, whatever, because they, when used appropriately, they can be heart openers, right? They can be ways in which people just connect with something differently that they can't get to just kind of with the one-on-one therapy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it.
I want to ask a question, going back to PTSD, because otherwise we're going to go down the plant medicine hole forever. Because, well, it's a it's a passionate topic of mine because it has helped me. So,
Right.
we could keep going. We can go back to it, but I wanted, because we're talking about PTSD, I wanted to know, how do you define PTSD?
That's a great question. Well, first thing that I would say is my conceptualization of PTSD has really changed over the course of time, and through I think the research and development that's gone into this area of healthcare for the last while. So I dropped the D and I put in an I, right? Where I really do think when we look at what's happening with the symptoms and the disruption that emerges after someone's experienced a trauma-related injury, we are seeing good reason to call this an injury by way of how the nervous system is impacted and how this dysregulates people's ability to cope with and regulate stress. And so, when I think about what's happening in a trauma, right? A trauma is something that massively overwhelms the system. It massively overwhelms the capacity, like it overloads it to cope with whatever's happening in the moment. And that oftentimes is driven by, an extreme reaction of stress. And so we get this extreme physiological and profound biological experience in the body that, that is actually pretty toxic and can be pretty damaging. But then that's typically paired with both interpersonal and psychological and emotional experiences that are also nonsensical and very, very difficult to sort of digest and process. And so therefore they have the potential to get increasingly separated from the person themselves because they're so overwhelming. So I think we have this like multifactorial experience in a trauma that is contributing to how people get injured in this way.
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it. I don't know if that fits for you. I mean, you guys know too, so.
No, but it's interesting to see it from another perspective too, right? Like it's good to hear it. I'm curious about, and you probably know the test, but I cannot remember the name of that test, which qualified a person who has PTSD. And that test, first responder, veterans, military has to score 30 some points, and a civilian have to score 20. And my curiosity here is, why is there a difference between a civilian and a first responder, veterans, and so on and so forth on the scoring test, right? Like, why do we defer this when one sees immensely more trauma in their life, most likely, versus the person who has less chance or probability to see trauma in one day? And why would it be less for civilian instead of why are we not making the same test?
It seems inverse. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So, I think you're talking about the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist.
Yes.
Yeah, the PCL. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. So it's not actually just solely connected to the overall or the ultimate score. It's also based on how the scoring is normed. So we have different versions of the PCL because in any psychometric that we use as psychologists in assessment, I'm going to give one of you guys a test, but then to figure out where you fall, I'm going to use your scores and I'm going to compare you. But in order for it to be a good comparison, it needs to be someone who's like you. And so in the development of the PCL, both the military and actually there's a police and a civilian version, there's a few different versions. The way the scoring was developed was to give that test to huge populations of civilians and military and then see how they score, and then essentially compare those scores against other psychometrics that can confirm or can support a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And then based on how if you responded on the PCL like this and you had a confirmed diagnosis of PTSD through some other measures, then we went, okay, well, a military member, is likely going to have this type of score. So it's a little bit, it's not totally apples and oranges.
Okay.
It just says that in the normative sample for military members and police officers who screened positively for a diagnosis, they tended to have a score profile or a pattern of scores like this. And that's where we get those cutoff scores from.
Okay.
And so there's some different, partly that's how, like, you obviously are familiar with it. So you'll know there's like different symptoms that you respond and you give an anchor to. Those are slightly different from version to version in terms of how we count up and sort of weight the different numbers that go along with the different symptoms.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think your point is very well taken, right? Which is, we now know that your typical service member is going to have hundreds of exposures to traumatic events, right? So in some ways we should be like setting the bar lower, but it's just a little bit of how the tests get designed so that they're actually valid ways of measuring this phenomenon with an individual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
it's
it
like
does. It does.
Apples to apples, oranges to oranges, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't, I guess if I understand this correctly, if you took a population of Canada that was in the civilian, I use that in quotations, we kind of differentiate service people from people that
totally.
don't serve in a emergency role. If you took a snippet of them, they would naturally score differently just because of the life they live. And so obviously somebody from John's line of work in the military or my line of work as a police officer, we're going to score totally different because we're exposed.
It's all good.
So
just wait a minute, buddy.
Yeah.
We'll cut it off. So
we take this. We take a moment to allow the dog to bark.
Like, why does somebody have to run my doorbell?
Oh, that's all good.
Freedom of expression right there.
Yeah. We're not stifling that dog. But that it does make sense. It does make sense that a person who is in the service world would score totally differently, and you couldn't compare them to a civilian who, my psychologist says, in the average 35-year career.
We love dogs. There's no issue.
We should have your dog on.
I like it. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's all good. I'll just continue when she's ready. It's all good.
Yeah.
Sorry, you guys.
Oh, don't be sorry. It's all good.
It's okay. It makes sense that a civilian would score totally differently. And I don't want to say lower. But that's kind of, I don't even know if that's what it is in a psychological sense, but it's different. And, like my psychologist mentioned that in a 30 to 35 year police career, the average police officer is going to experience 800 traumas. Now, I don't know if that's the exact number, but it's hundreds, like you said, versus a civilian might only experience a few traumas in their life. The death of loved ones, maybe, the worst case scenario, they get attacked by somebody or are
accident,
a victim of
car
accident, or see something terrifying or awful. And, police officers and military personnel are inundated with that every single day, right? So you couldn't compare the two.
No, you can't. So, I mean, I think, just the final point on that test question is that I think that's exactly how we need to think about it, is that we really are assessing something different when we're looking at a civilian versus a service member. And therefore, the tests and the scores and the cutoffs and all that, they are different just because of that. I actually think 800 is low. I sat down with a cop last year. He's now out of the service and is doing other work. And we got talking about this stuff, and he came back. We had a meeting one day, and he came back a month later on just to follow up on what we were working on. And he was like, I counted it up, and I think his number was 14,306. Like, if he looked at what would be actually considered, according to our diagnostic criteria, a traumatic exposure, he was like over 14,000. And that actually doesn't surprise me, right?
No.
We've got some data that's coming out. I don't know if you guys know Nick Carlton out of CIPSERT, which is the Canadian Institute for. Okay, well, put him on your list. He'd be a great guest. Okay. But there's a lot of research going into this, right? In Nick's group, has been doing some work with RCMP members who are coming into depot and tracking them over time. And, they're seeing that there's potentially hundreds of exposures within a few years of service, right? So, and that gets distributed differently depending on if you're rural or urban or, what part of the country and right? But it's a very, very different animal we're talking about when we're talking about trauma exposure in uniformed service personnel versus, someone who's doesn't do this kind of a job, as their occupation. That's not to say that people in civilian context don't experience trauma. Of course they do. The experience of trauma and the onset of trauma-related conditions just is a very, very different thing. So, coming back to how do I think about PTSD and this injury and whatever? I mean, I think of it as a repetitive use injury. Frankly, we're repetitively and unfairly using the stress response system in the body, and it's when we're talking about trauma-related conditions in service members, I actually feel and believe that we're going to need to get to a place where we have a totally different nomenclature, diagnostic system, way that we actually think about trauma in service versus trauma in civilian populations.
Absolutely. John?
Like it. No, I'm reflecting on it. It just takes time, that's the PTSD brain. Let's go. It's just, well, it'd be fantastic. I like the accent.
Thank you.
It's like, I've always felt like it's like part of our wiring, part of our evolutionary wiring in our mind is being hijacked.
Yep.
And I say this, and I hope I was somewhat accurate, that to this day we can't really point a finger at you're going to get PTSD. You take, for example, there's about 60 members that work out of my detachment. You can't line 60 members up and say, "Yep, you're going to get it. Yep, you're going to get it." Are we still there? Are we still sort of firing like a shotgun and not really able to keyhole the reason why some people get it and some don't?
Yeah, I mean, so this is my opinion, nobody else's. Disclaimer.
Yep.
I think the desire to land this at an individual's lap is possibly or possibly has been an attempt to divorce oneself from responsibility of needing to do something different in approaching this problem. I think if you can say it's because somebody doesn't have enough education, or it's because, they had too many traumas in a childhood, or it's because they're a woman, or it's because this or that, then I think people go, well, that's the reason, right? And so therefore we can keep doing business as usual and we don't have to do things different. And nowadays that just doesn't hold up, right? When you actually account for gender and years of education and adverse childhood experiences, blah blah blah, the most significant predictor of whether someone's going to develop a post-traumatic stress injury is the degree of exposure they've had. How many times have they been shot at? How many times have they confronted violent death, either the risk to themselves or happening to someone else? It simply is the number of trauma exposures that we're talking about. And so therefore, can you line 60 people up? Actually, I think you can. And I think we could give 60 people this injury if we put the right ingredients in place, right? Which is constantly expose them to trauma, limit or disrupt their ability to really process and digest what's happened to them vis-a-vis those traumas, and put them in an organizational culture and perhaps a societal culture that says, if you can't handle this, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, I was hoping that we would get there.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think we could probably, it would no doubt take different amounts of trauma and different amounts of time, but I bet we could probably round up everybody, and maybe with the exception of one person every 10,000, I think we could probably create this degree of symptomatology in anybody if we followed that ingredient list.
Yeah.
How many times, not how many times, because it would be a specific number, but what I'm curious is the relapse that happen, right? Do you find that I'm curious if it happens more when the people goes back to work, or the person who goes back to they cannot go back to work and that function. So from me talking to people, so there's no statistic that I took here.
Yeah.
I've heard, and Jade, you're one of them, but people who goes back to work too early or did not make peace with their own traumas, or they should have spent more time or whatever that is, or they've been rushed due to system, or so on and so forth. Quite often they end up in a relapse aspect, right? Because we identify as our uniform, we want to go back with the boys or the girls and whatnot, and serve, because that's all we know how to do, right? And in our mind, I think. But would you say that going back is one of the factor that there are more chance that people relapse when you go back quickly? Because I've heard that about the people who do those really like the 90 days, like the 2 months full time and so on and so forth. And I believe that some people cannot do full time. It is too much. As same as I believe that one session for some people per week is clearly not enough, because there's a process that you have to do at home or wherever you are at. What is your take on this? Is there more relapse when you go back to work?
So let me just say, you guys are asking really good questions. I'm like, whew, I got to brush up here. So you're going to find this about me as we continue to talk, that you're going to ask me a question, then I'm going to go off on a 10-minute explanation. So my apologies right out the gate.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great question. I approach my answer to it probably from two directions. One is, one of the things in my clinical work and something that I really do believe is that this is a very serious injury, right? This is a very serious injury that is disrupting and dysregulating how stress is regulated in our bodies. And so therefore we need to treat it as seriously. And what I try to get people to appreciate or to understand is that, you know, if you were on duty and something happened and you were injured and you broke your back or you broke your pelvis, right? You were in a bad accident and you had to have your pelvis, like, you know, in surgery, reconstructed and pins put together. And then you had to, you know, be immobilized for however many months. And then you had to start doing rehab and physio and whatever. We would all understand, just like that is such a serious injury that we would no doubt expect that this person would have some degree of pain probably as they carried forward in their lives. They'd probably have to stretch every day, maybe see physio every so often, really work on staying mobile, right? Like this was going to be something they had to manage for the rest of their life, and that there would be things that would improve, you know, their pain management and how they were living with this injury. And then there would be things that would worsen it, right? Like if they were just sitting all the time and putting on, you know, weight in the middle or something, right? Like there'd be these things, and we would just get that. And I think what we need to really conceptualize with a post-traumatic stress injury is that, from my perspective, that's the equivalency of what we're talking about, right? And so someone sustains this injury, they develop, you know, symptoms, they can engage in really, really effective treatments of different kinds to reduce their level of symptoms or pain, right, in this analogy. But there's going to have to be something that they do on an ongoing basis, probably a daily basis, to stay on top of managing this thing, because this is an injury that, you know, can be healed and improved, but it's probably going to have a degree of scar tissue, meaning it's going to have this vulnerability to acting up. And in this example, it acts up in the context of stress, right? So when the conditions of stress in a person's life changes, no doubt they're going to experience some flares of how this stress-related injury is being experienced by them, right? So then when we look at people coming back to work, I would submit that still, like to this very day, there is still a lot of work to be done on how people come back to work, both how they go off, how they are when they're off, and then how they come back. And the coming back process needs to be a really supported, you know, appropriately paced, you know, commensurate to the person's ability to sort of expose and regulate and get used to their jobs again, right? I think sometimes what we do is we rush people back. People are rushed back to work when maybe they need some more time or they need different kinds of modifications. And actually, I really believe that people have a lot of capacity to go back to the job that they were doing, so long as it gets paced appropriately and supported in the ways that we know can be helpful. And I just don't think that happens very often. So for sure, we see people who don't maybe get the conditions they need to go back to work, and then they have flare-ups, right? Because they're back in this organization, they've got all sorts of cues that are activating all of this trauma response, that stress is changing, so they're getting more dysregulated. And then, you know, if people are going back to being in uniform, they're probably still getting exposed to traumatic events or, you know, stressors or whatever. So, you know, and to some extent that can be dealt with slightly differently. But if we just hold that part aside, just how we're helping people go back to work, I think needs some work.
Yeah,
Mm.
Yeah, I agree. Would you say that sanctuary trauma is one of the issue as well?
I for sure think that sanctuary trauma is a part of the issue. And it's interesting to me. There's a working group that I've been part of in the country that has posted or published a glossary of terms that's related to the work of public safety. And the second version of the glossary came out like 2 years or something like that ago. They've just published the most recent version, and it now holds sanctuary trauma as one of the terms, which is cool, right? It's like there's this recognition that this is a thing. And yeah, absolutely. If somebody is really devoted and committed to the job that they've learned to do and they've trained to do, and maybe they love to do, and they're happening to do it in an environment that has been part of the challenge or the issue for them, like, how can people go back into an environment where they're automatically hypervigilant because they don't know if they're safe, and safe meaning safe with the people around them, safe from criticism, safe from being rejected, all the things that are really oppositional to people healing and recovering.
Yeah. I'll give myself as an example, Megan, and I know you'll understand. The first time, so I'm one of the examples of somebody who worked for a long period of time and then returned to the office and got back to work and did 2.5 years, and now I'm off. One of the greatest factors that I struggled with was that very thing. And I spoke to my psychologist about that probably half the time, was how do I deal with going back to work? How do I deal with what I perceive is the sneering and the jeering and the negative comments behind my back, and people treating me like I've got a communicable disease that's going to spread, and they don't trust me anymore because they think I'm going to break down at the wrong call, or I'm not have their back, and I'm going to have a panic attack at the wrong time. And so that has been paramount to my attempt at recovering for a very long time, is trying to overcome that problem. That's I guess that sort of is wrapped up in the word stigma, the continuing stigma that we see in the departments, in the police stations, in the military. And so do you see that in your clients? Is that something that's ever present in the clients that you deal with? For me, that was a massive part of my problem, and it continues to be to this day, not as much as I heal, but it has been ever present in my healing and my trauma.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I just find that to be so shameful, like that's the experience still. And I think it's the experience still. I think it has gotten better. But if I like to marry what the science and data tells us with my anecdotal experience, right? And the science and data is telling us that, yeah, it's gotten better, but we've still got at least half, if not 2/3 of a workforce in public safety going, I wouldn't trust my peers, my colleagues, to tell them about what I'm struggling with. I don't feel comfortable that people aren't criticizing me or aren't going to reject me in some kind of a way. And so I'm going to keep things to myself, right? Like that stigma is alive and well, very much still. And yes, it's getting better. But man, there's still a lot of that lingering pressure. And what it does is it forces people to internalize, and it forces, it creates that paranoia and that suspicion and that lack of trust. And again, like fertile, beautiful things can't grow in that kind of terrain. It's impossible, And so what do, right? Well, you either adapt or change yourself to fit the terrain, or you pick yourself up and move, right? So that you can plant yourself somewhere else and grow in a more healthy fashion.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of the initiatives that I have been involved in for a while, that I continue to be, and I really support, is are you familiar with reintegration programs?
I'm in it for the veteran side of things.
Okay. Yeah. So reintegration is becoming increasingly a bit of a standard about how to help people come back to work. And the idea is that you actually have reintegration officers within a department who get trained on how to help one of their peers who's trying to come back to work do workplace exposures, get back into the detachment or the hall or whatever. So there's like this bridge between ending treatment and being back at work. And it's showing some pretty good success in terms of, challenging some of these ideas around stigma and actually giving people a mechanism to come back to work in a safer fashion. So I'm hopeful that will continue to gain some traction and that we'll see that becoming increasingly a standard.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I have tons of questions and the fun one. Have you ever been afraid of someone who sit across you? Because by all means, we're servant, but some of us, and count me in, I had an anger that was a certain level at one time.
Yeah.
I'm 5'7", so I'm not that dangerous. But I mean, there's some of the guys, gals who are big people, and with anger and so on. Like, did it ever happen to you? To be afraid of one of your client?
Oh, interesting. I like that.
That's a great question. Yeah. So physically scared twice. Once when I was working at the OSI clinic. And so that was a little bit better because I had a lot more people around. Once in my independent practice where it was just me. So that was a little bit scarier for sure. I have had the occasional time where I've walked my car at the end of the day where I'm like, this would be an interesting experience. Like, there could be somebody who's lurking or whatever. It doesn't happen all that often. So, but, more times in terms of, I suppose there's a lot of the reactions that people have that I don't take personally. And so I maybe have and I've just done this work for a while and I've seen a lot of reactions and behaviors from people. So I probably have a different threshold for this. I've probably put up with people's sort of abusive behavior, verbal abusive behavior or emotional abusive behavior more than I should to some extent. And that's an evolving, bit of wisdom, I guess, for me as I continue to grow as a psychologist. But yeah, probably only twice, and I think it's a great question because again, I have been doing this for a long time. And I do think it's important for us to decouple this notion that people who have PTSD related anger are therefore automatically dangerous, because I don't think that's true. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I also have a bit of a perspective, I guess, that I bring to the work too, which is, if you do something that crosses a line with me, like, you're not going to be welcome back. And so like make a choice for yourself. Right. And I find that people are generally speaking pretty respectful of that. Yeah. But it's hard work. Like, it's emotionally taxing work for sure. Right. And because it's like, I don't know. I like, even today, I had clients earlier today. And I sit there sometimes with my clients and I'm just like, fuck, like, am I allowed to swear? Sorry.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. It's no biggie.
Emails seal in French, so it's totally fine.
Oh, that's right. But like, it's just this thing of like, is this enough? Am I doing enough? Am I helping people? Because this is it can be a very complicated injury to try to help people recover from. Right. And so when people are really dysregulated or really, really angry or struggling with so much grief and trying to figure out who they are, like, that's more of the difficulty versus threats of violence or aggression.
Well, and I would say too that most of the people that come to you that are actually interested in getting therapy are not psychotic, because most psychotic people wouldn't come to therapy.
Totally.
I don't need therapy. I'm fine. Or they would immediately go right up against you without ever coming to their own problem. And then there would be nothing that you could serve for them because you're not becoming the thing that they're requiring in their narcissistic way. Right. So
Totally.
at least I think that's a way. A lot of people in our line of work are probably not psychopathic. And so you would probably very quickly be able to weed out the dangerous ones, if any, right?
100%. Yeah. And that's exactly, I think you're both hitting the nail on the head here. Like, those aren't typically the people that show up for what I have to offer, for what we have to offer. It happens, right? But again, it's really actually relatively rare, because if people are coming in to see me or to see one of my colleagues, it's like, there's something that's not going well typically in their life. And they're seeking us out, right? Like they're not being ordered to come. There's not sort of conditions being placed on them, like in a forensic context or whatever. So yeah, usually it happens all the time where people will come in and they'll be like, oh, my spouse is, making me come here, or, they're super angry about things. But that's just the starting point. That's, it's like, you tell me why you're here then, right? Because I'm not going to be, I absolutely adopt the perspective of there's absolutely nothing that you are going to let me know about yourself, or I'm going to find out about you. There's absolutely nothing I can make you do. Like my job is to try to facilitate and observe, and you're only going to let me get to know you to the extent that you're going to let me get to know you. And that's not my choice, right? I can try to ask questions and I can try to be thoughtful, but that's the dance of therapy. That's the dance of recovery, right? It has to be something that you are driving within yourself. And if you're not, then what are you doing here? Right. And few people like to just play the game, right? And just do it for the hell of it. Right. That doesn't happen very often, at least not in my setting. Thank God.
Yeah, no kidding. Sitting across, I've sat across from a psychopath a few times on the job.
Really? Hey.
And there's something really eerie about it.
I bet. Yeah.
They give off, it's almost not human. It's so it's so predatory and strange, the energy they give off and the way that they talk and the way that they look at you. And it only maybe twice in my career where I would say in my lay, ignorant person terms that they were a true psychopath. And there's something really unique about it. So I'm sure you probably don't have to worry about that very often.
No, I don't think so. Like, I just don't think that would be like, that's not really a population I think that would self-select to sit in front of me. I think for sure, yeah. I tend to see people who, the struggle that I have in my work is that because the injury, as I'm talking about, is so like, it has this capacity to just dysregulate people. And so they show up in all sorts of different ways, at different points in time, especially early in recovery. Sometimes it's hard to figure out, are we talking about trauma and a trauma-related condition, or are we talking about, like, is somebody having characterological, personality kinds of stuff, like that we would, that people talk about, people use terms like narcissism and stuff like that. Sometimes that takes a little bit longer to figure out with someone, and usually you need to know somebody for a longer period of time to like see if this is more of an interpersonal difficulty, relating to other people and keeping relationships going and what have you, that is bigger than or more than only being about trauma, right? Yeah. But that just takes time, and that's not really even worrisome from my perspective, because that's the kind of people that we want to be able to try to see anyways, right? To try to help. So I just think, I hate it when it happens in the media where, some high profile crime or something will happen. And what's the first thing that gets reported on is, whatever the mental health condition was or is, or if this person was a veteran and therefore were they, violent or dangerous. Like, I just think that's just not fair,
Yeah. And statistically, they're one in thousands and thousands of people, right? And then everybody else gets painted and labeled that way. So
yeah, exactly. No, I mean, more so, like I would say very, very consistently, there's so much more shame and self-recrimination and, fears of being too much or taking up too much time or how they might be harming other people. It's way more often that I see than people who are, aggressive and angry towards other people.
Yeah. See, I saw it a lot with people. For the anger was coming from the fact that they don't have control over their own emotion, right? Because the valve was closed for so long that now it's pouring and they have no control whatsoever, right? So from the anger to the sadness, to usually the anger is the protector of the sadness, whatever that is, right? So I am curious, because we're in the word of talking about PTSD. Do you find that PTSD is used nowadays lightly, like overly used without being diagnosed? And I have PTSD, right? Like I've heard it pulling over people for tickets for talking on their phone. I've heard the COVID PTSD. I've heard, and I mean, I think that sadly, mental health, and that's my own opinion, there's no statistics on this, has been overly used, right? I'm depressive. Well, do you have I have depression, or are you diagnosed? And it's been overly used. What is your take on this?
I definitely think we have bogarted the use, the terminology of trauma and PTSD into our common day lexicon in a way that is really unfair and inappropriate, right? Like we talk about being traumatized, we talk about having PTSD from this, that, or the other, and it's not, right? And I get it, whatever, we all do it, right? Like, oh my gosh, I had to wait in line, I'm so traumatized by that. Well, yeah, it's like it becomes a turn of phrase or something. And I guess I sometimes think like, if people actually understood the nature of what they were saying, they might choose different words, right? And I guess it's a great question. I think about this a lot. I think about this probably every day. Like we see that like mental health issues, whether in uniform service or not, like it's a global issue. It's like the World Health Organization identified depression as like the most significant social determinant of health or something. It's $1 trillion problem around the world. And what is that about? Like, how did we get here? Has it always been like this and we didn't know? Has this been something about the advent of the technological age, which that's where I put my chips. Are people legitimately this depressed and this anxious and this unwell psychologically? I actually think there's a possibility that we are. And I think we see a lot of the societal decline or issues we're having, I think is connected to that. And I also think we have done a disservice to suffering and to difficulty because we've allowed it to become this thing where it gives people a right or a reason to not be functional. And I don't know that that's necessarily fair, right? I think some of the wisest people, I think some of the people who have offered the most to our human species, the people I admire and respect the most, have incredible stories of suffering and adversity to tell. And they've done something with it. They've done something profound with it. And so I guess I just think that we've done something where we've said, oh, if you're not feeling well, that's a bad thing. And we should protect you from that, or we should, lessen the expectations or the demands on you. And I'm not sure that's the right equation.
Yeah.
I think it is about, oh, sorry, go ahead. See, I told you I can get going and
I like it. That's fine. That's why we're here.
You just hit on something that I think about all the time, and it's very similar. I do think that we kind of live now in a sick society. And I mean that physically and emotionally and mentally. We're so far removed from what we used to be. And it doesn't matter if you're a God-fearing person who believes in the creation story, or if you fall in line with most people who think that we evolved to be this way. But think about how we were for almost all of our existence. We were surrounded by a small village or a small tribe, and everybody dealt with everything.
Yep.
So if you had some sorrowful feelings, if something traumatic happened in the tribe was around you to help you. You ate natural foods. You slept and were awake with the rising and the setting of the sun and the moon. That your circadian rhythm was always in check. You were always grounded. That you could just go down the list of all of the things that are biologically and physiologically and emotionally disrupted now in society. And everybody's on the spectrum now because we are all in these little boxes. We're this.
Yeah.
Right. This is how we're connected. And we always have shoes on. We don't eat the right foods. We don't commune properly. We don't even have community in a lot of places anymore. And so when you take this upstream to the emergency services area, we're already all unwell in some way. And then you exacerbate that 1,000-fold with literally thousands of traumas in a 30-year career span. And you got to have some understanding that everybody's going to be on a spectrum of some kind of trauma, injury, or some kind of mental health pathology that's following them because of how we exist.
Totally. I mean, I find it so interesting that like, if you read the mental health literature, you look at sleep science or whatever, it's like, if we all went out and slept in the woods for 2 weeks without our phones, we'd reset our sleep schedules. And it's just like, how is that novel? Right? Like, exactly. This is not that long ago. I mean, certainly, like, I don't know about you guys, but I didn't get my first cell phone until I was in my 20s, right? Like, we're not talking about that much time we're completely plugged into it all. And I very much am in sort of, I would be an evolutionary biologist, independent of whatever my spiritual sort of framework is. And I just don't think we have kept up. We haven't evolved to keep up with how we are living in this overpopulated, highly stimulating environment that we find ourselves in pretty much around the world. I mean, I know there's some pockets of the world where that's not the case, but right, like this isn't how we're supposed to live. And I just think we've done this thing where, and there's some really interesting books on this if you're interested, but like we've convinced people that they should be feeling good and happy all the time. I had a really interesting conversation with a colleague of mine a number of years ago, and he's kind of a historian, and started talking about how like we're not surrounded by death anymore, and our ancestors were, and so death was just part of life, and therefore it wasn't something to be feared. And people would have people or animals, or you'd see more relationships between predators and prey in the natural environment. You would just see death and violence and whatever, but it was all part of the life cycle, and it was all part of the ecosystem of how everything sort of related to one another. And so therefore, was there more capacity to integrate those kinds of experiences? I would say yes, right? Like there's so many people that I encounter in the course of a day that are just woefully prepared for the fact that life is not easy, and it's not going to get easier as they progress in their lives either.
Yeah, I think that's due to as well parenting. I think there's some mistake that is done where we give too much to kids and they don't have to work for it, right? But anyways, that's another tangent that we can go for
down
a long time.
But John, I said that because you wanted to go somewhere with the conversation about BOS.
Yes, but I'm getting there soon enough. But I have one more question as well.
Okay,
it's just boiling right now
for like 5 hours. No, we're gonna have to have you on. We're gonna have to have you on a couple of times.
I would love to. Oh my god, anytime. This is awesome. Yeah.
So if we look at statistics in Canada and so on, and in US, and different allies country, if you wish, the average is roughly 15 to 18% of service member in the military who end up with PTSD, depending on it is. And recently, in the past few wars, so if we look at the latest one, which is Afghanistan that we had, there's the number increased. But during 9/11, when everything started off at the beginning surrounding this year, because citizens were very involved emotionally with what happened, because it happened at home, especially in US, the percentage of PTSD was lower. If we look at countries that have conscription, and they're forced to serve either at 18 years old or they go to university, the percentage of PTSD is super low, right? We're talking about 1%, because people can understand each other, right? Would you say that it's actually that statistic is realistic of what we're going through? Because a lot of people, and I talked to my friends who went to Afghanistan, I didn't go there, and they were truly upset. And what we've seen, during when they left Afghanistan, when the American left Afghanistan, it was in the news for a week or two, and then we didn't give a shit. Right, which was very upsetting for a bunch of vets who sacrificed sweat, tears, blood overseas, and friends. Would you say that it's part of it, like the fact that the community doesn't seem to care at all? And community, about population, right? Like Canadian Americans, whatever that is.
So you've bundled a number of different thoughts and questions into that description there. So there's a lot of reasons, I think, why it is after 9/11 and sort of at the beginning of that conflict, why we saw reductions perhaps of how people were being impacted by trauma. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, right? Like there was a really, at least a North American or a Western civilization unity that came to what's happened to people and how do we rally together, and motivated a lot of people to get really involved. And so there's a shared purpose and a shared meaning and a standing up to something and all of that. And that's really important, right? That's really important. Those are important protective factors for us when we're going through horrible times, right? You think about again, in remote history, people used to have periods of, whole years where they would mourn the loss of a loved one, or people would sit Shiva or different things, right? Like when you have the way to bring people together around a common experience so that they can share and focus and be united in their suffering and what they're going to do with it, that does something really important and really powerful for people, for sure, right? I think, I don't know this for sure, but when I think about if we fast forward to, the US pulling out of Afghanistan and all that involved, I think to some extent for service members that mirrored a little bit of what happened in Vietnam, right? Which was, there was this really profound sense of betrayal. Like, why did you do this to us? And why did you do this to these people? And a lot of our military members, for sure, developed deep ties and connections to, Afghani civilians, and really felt as though they had been there for a really profound reason, and felt like they themselves were betraying the people that they said that they were going to help. So, there was all sort, and then something, something being imposed both on them as well as the people who are being left behind. And that's really risky from a psychological perspective, right? That creates all sorts of guilt and anger and moral injuries and all of those kinds of pieces, right?
And we left our translator too down there, right?
Right.
Yeah. I know some of my friends were upset because of that, because the
sure.
guy who translated for them now is stuck there, and we're not helping.
No, and even more than that, like, is stuck there and is also probably now known to have been, supporting the other side, kind of thing, right? So I think that's, again, a decision made that people didn't have influence over, that really just cut people to the quick around what did we do and how could we do this to people, and really feeling a sense of responsibility and and having failed, right? Having failed people that they sort of promised or guaranteed that they would care and they would help, right?
Yeah.
I think when we look statistically, your numbers, again, I think are a little bit on the low side. So some data that we had come out in Canada in 2018 suggested that almost 50%, so 44.5% of service members in the sample that were screened were screening positive for at least one mental health condition, and commonly that was PTSD. I think when we look at statistics for military and veterans, we sometimes saw as high as 25% of Canadian soldiers returning who were screening positive for commonly PTSI. So, and I think the challenge we have, at least in the Afghanistan circumstances, that most of that force was reserve force, right? So they came back to Canada and weren't necessarily, attached to a unit or even a base hospital or anything like that. So I think our numbers are probably a little bit, maybe not 100% valid, but I think we've got pretty good estimates, right? Which is, there's conditions here that really, that can be very hurtful to people if they don't have the right conditions to stay connected to people and feel supported and not shamed, and be given the time and space to grieve and fully process the experiences that they've had. We tend to treat, in my humble opinion, our service people as machines, right? And then we get mad at them for not behaving in deeply human kinds of ways, right? It's a very strange contradiction.
And there's also got to be a hidden factor in there, and I'll use my own example again. Now that I feel like I'm sort of like a layperson expert, and N of one expert on my own symptoms and how I reacted to PTSI. I like that you're calling it an injury, right? Instead of a disorder. I've been able to observe servicemen and women at my detachment and see myself in them. Mm. So when you're interviewing people and you're trying to take a snippet or an average from people, you're going to get lots of people that just lie to you and don't actually get captured by the data because they refuse or fail to actually admit. So the statistics are probably much higher
100%.
by 5% or 10%, because there's a whole host of people that would just be unwilling to admit that they do have these symptoms and that they would be categorized as, having one or more mental health injuries.
Go ahead.
You look at the first responder realm, right? Which is very interesting. And I might be totally wrong, right? I'm looking at statistics for the fun of it. You look at policing, which there's way more men doing policing, and the percentage is extremely low. I was looking at the one in Alberta was 5%, give or take, and that's probably 5-6 years ago, so I might be off now. But you were looking then at paramedics, and we're talking about 22-25%, which, I mean, it's 6 times the amount. And the difference is there as well is your environment, who you work more. Men are not necessarily always known to be the best communicator of feelings. Right, or being upfront about what they're going through, and so on and so forth, and add up the sanctuary trauma, or how you're going to be seen, shamed, guilt, whatever you want to call it. And what Jay says is totally true, right? Like, I don't want to go back up that person because they're crazy. And I don't want to have like negative notes in my whatever, my file or whatever that is. It's I think it's sad because they probably have it too. And I'm with you, with Jay. I'm like, I don't know how many people I sat with them, and I'm like, go see someone. Like, I have that, and I'm not working right now, so you should see someone.
I want to give a quick shout out. Sorry, Megan, if I could just interrupt. I just about finished this book, Setting My Sights on Stigma, and it's by Mark Bouchard. And he was an ERT sergeant who ended up very mentally unwell. And he wrote right in this book that one of the great factors why he was hiding everything, because he knew he was going to get removed from ERT.
Yep.
That most police forces, if they find out that you have a mental health trauma, you're gone, man. You're off specialty.
Yeah.
They don't think that you're useful anymore, or there's too much operational stress. Worry that like I'm talking about the force itself, worry that you'll be a liability, and so boom, you're gone. And that, like, he writes that in his book, that was one of the biggest factors in why he was refusing to speak out.
Of course.
The military is the same.
Yep.
Yeah.
Totally.
You're not deployable. I mean, you sign up, you know you're going to go most likely to war, right? So you need to. It's like when they ask for the police, right? Are you willing to kill someone for the greater good, right? Same thing, right? And if you are, I know special force, you'll be kicked out because you will take a seat unless you're an operator or assaulter, because that's your trade. But then you're not deployable, and if you're not deployable, they're not keeping you because you're a head who has a position that they want to replace.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. For sure. And, it just creates a compounding sort of forward domino kind of an effect, right? So then people don't share about very natural and adaptive reactions they're having to things. They internalize them. They, make use of ineffective or less sophisticated coping strategies. They maybe then are using drugs and alcohol to settle down their nervous systems, whatever, and on and on and on and on it goes, right? And then ultimately, how many guys on ERT or people on ERT or whatever have I talked to where it's just like, yeah, I knew for years that this was going on for me, and I did everything I possibly could to try to keep it together until I couldn't anymore. And those are the people that, at least a number of years ago were ending up in my office. And it was just like, fuck, like these, you've been through no fault of their own. I mean, they've been holding it together for so long. And then they finally come into care. And it's just like, we have to really spend some time grieving what you had there, because it ain't going to look like that as we move forward. Right. There's just been too much chronicity here. There's too many ways in which your life is accommodated to all the ways in which you were trying to keep it together to keep doing your jobs. And like, that is just, I just refuse to accept that as the norm that we should be on board with, right? Because it's just bullshit, and it doesn't stand up to, again, the realities of the jobs that you folks are doing, right? Like you're doing very, very unique work. You're doing exceptionally stressful and demanding work that exposes you to unimaginable suffering. Why should we expect that you don't need a unique and diverse set of, factors and supports to help you keep doing those jobs? Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have millions of questions, but let's talk about BOS.
Yeah, let's get to BOS, because I think, Megan, we're going to I wrote so much stuff down, but we're going to run out of time. So we're going to have you on again.
I'd love to. Yeah, anytime, for sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's really important that, because John brought this up at the beginning. So go with it, John, because I think this is a great subject to finalize this first talk.
Yeah.
So Jay, you and I, we know R2MR, right? The road to mental readiness,
Yeah.
which is a nice chart of colors to tell you that you're in that there and whatever that is. And if you don't see anything, you're in the black, right? And it's a nice whatever 3 hours of course that I personally sat. There was a nurse telling us this, and nobody cared because it was not a person from the street, right? And I mean, the military used to call it suicide awareness, I believe, back in 2009 or 8. Um, and now there's a BOS, which I've heard from friends because I'm not in the service since it came out. But please talk about it because it's before operational stress, correct?
Yes. Yep. Have either of you taken it?
No,
No, him, no.
I've never heard of it.
Oh, you haven't? Oh my goodness. Well,
Until I started studying you, I'd never heard it.
oh wow. Okay. Well, I'll get my team to register you tomorrow, and you can take a look at it if you'd like, just to
I'd
see.
love to. Yeah, and I'd love to have the links so we could add it to the show notes.
Oh my God, absolutely. Yeah, I'll get that to you tomorrow. So with that story that I was just telling about, there was a point in my career, and so this would have been like 2015 or something like that, where I'd been now on my own in community practice for 4 years, and literally was run off my feet. Like I was seeing like, I don't know, 35 people a week, and all guys like you, women, who service members, and that picture, right? Like had been holding on for as long as they possibly could because they didn't want to lose their careers. They didn't want to have to face, being cast out from their friend groups and the people that they worked with and all the stuff, right? All the reasons why. And so I spent a good chunk of time, a few years, like just putting Band-Aids on bullet holes, right? Of just like, probably you're not going back to work. Your marriages have fallen apart. You may have a comorbid substance problem. We're fighting with WCB. Like that was just the day in and day out. And I honestly got to a place of just being like, if this is all we're doing, I can't, I just can't be on board with this. This is just shameful. And so there was a few things that coalesced at the same time. One was in my clinical practice. So speaking of R2MR, I have nothing but great things to say about R2MR because it got the conversation started, right? Like it got people thinking about and talking about this thing around mental health is an important subject. So I was hearing in treatment all the time from the folks I was working with when I was teaching them about this is what trauma is, this is what's happening in your nervous system, this is how we're going to help you to try to regulate it, blah, 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 all the things that we do in treatment. I was hearing from people that, man, I wish I had known this when I started my career. Like if I'd known some of this stuff, maybe I would have been able to be on the lookout for it, do different things to have taken care of myself. And then for folks who had also taken R2MR, they had this experience of like, well, now I understand the mental health continuum and where I sit on it, but now what? Like, what do I do to like deal with all this? If I've identified particularly that I'm in the red, what do I do? And if I'm not in the red, but I'm heading there, how do I prevent myself from getting there? So I had a little bit of an existential or an occupational crisis and sat down one weekend with my husband and was like, you write and I'm going to spit some stuff out at you. And we wrote Boss. And so and you may need to have me come back so that I can talk about this for hours at length. But one of my strong beliefs is that, in contemporary public safety, uniform service context, we have massively misinterpreted some philosophical norms that were crucial in how warrior culture and service culture developed, with our ancient ancestors. And again, there's a long lecture here, but what we've done in contemporary times is we've equated people's competency with the idea that they're stoic, right? They can handle it. They're seemingly impenetrable by the work that they're doing. They've got the broad shoulders, the stiff upper lip. They're the tough guys. They're disciplined and competitive and mastery and all of this stuff, right? That's what the ideal is. And if you meet that ideal, you're like this idol to be admired, and you're the epitome of somebody who's like stoic in the face of all this work. And we've really bastardized and misinterpreted what the Stoics, the actual philosophy of the warrior culture and the warrior, the stoicism that influenced how warrior culture developed. We've completely misinterpreted what that was all supposed to all be about. And there's a longer conversation about that. But what we've done in present times is we've set people up to be like, if you show any vulnerability, or if you seemingly are impacted emotionally by the work that you're doing, there's something wrong with you. Right. And so then people have drank this poison from when they started their careers of like, I have to be good to go regardless. It doesn't matter what's happening inside of me. I can't show it. I can't put it out there. And so what I've tried to do with the Before Operational Stress program is basically say, look, here's the realities of the work that you're doing. Here's what the science and data tells us. And this thing about this sort of suck it up culture is highly toxic. It's highly toxic to anybody, but we've really, really done some unfair things to men and around men and masculinity and what that all means in this space as well, because it's really encouraged a whole generation or generations of people to alienate themselves from whole portions of their human experience, and particularly their emotional or their emotionally vulnerable experiences. So that's where we start. And then it's an 8-hour program. If you do it by yourself, it can be longer, give or take. But we talk about the neurobiology of trauma. We talk about, actually, here's what it means when you become dysregulated, and here's how you regulate yourself. We teach people cognitive behavioral skills to use to help with how you're thinking about things, help with how you're thinking about and experiencing emotion, really teaching people about avoidance and how avoidance plays into maintaining trauma reactions. And then we talk about communication and relationships and like how to be a better human in the context of your relationships and communicate more effectively. And then we finish with sort of a new way of approaching work, which is to say, it's a construct called functional disconnection and functional reconnection. And the idea is there's a place and time where you need to have that suck it up ability, that ability to put on the face and do your job and, do that. And that's adaptive. And there needs to be this other space in the functional reconnection where you actually tune back into who you are, how this affected you, what you need to process, and you ideally do that in community. So that's the program in a nutshell. And that's really where my existential crisis took me, was to build that with the idea in mind of give this to people when they're starting their careers at a minimum, but give this kind of literacy education to anybody who's going to put on a uniform for work so that they can understand some of what they're going to encounter and some of what the things are that they can do to take care of themselves.
Do you think they should, the spouse should see that as well?
Well, isn't that interesting? So yes, I'm actually, we have a spouse program that's a complement to BOSS that we've been working on for the last couple of years. And actually we still have we have until the end of March, we have funding for spouses in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. We need 20 spouses to make up a group, if you guys know anybody. Anyways, but yes, absolutely. You should involve the spouse. The spouse should have a lot of this kind of education as well.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And here's a final thought on before operational stress. Wouldn't it be wonderful if when we went to police college or to academy training, that instead of having to memorize federal statutes and provincial statutes and sit in class and do all of the boring work that when you get on the road you realize was completely meaningless because you're going to learn it anyways.
Right.
Instead, what we were learning is this kind of stuff. Wouldn't that be a way better return on investment for every employer if instead of 50% of people, you could reduce that to 30% of people that would potentially end up developing an injury that caused them to leave work, right?
Oh my God, that's the dream, right? That's 100% the dream, is like, yeah. And actually, and so I am encouraged because like the Toronto Police Service is an example. They just adopted, we've been working with them for a few years, but they now are putting all their recruits through BOSS. York Police are doing that. Justice Institute of BC is doing that. A bunch of firefighting departments are doing it. So we're seeing it, right? We're seeing people get this. And that's my point. I'm like, I'm under no misgivings to think that BOSS is going to eradicate, post-traumatic stress injuries in uniformed service. That's impossible. But exactly, what if we could take that from 50 to 30? Like the number of lives and children and families and communities that would be impacted by that, let alone just the cost savings of that,
Yeah. Well, and then decade after decade, it would improve, because at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about how, we don't have total buy-in yet on being respectful of these as real injuries. However, as the culture shifts and you sort of start cutting off the generations at the end of their careers, they're being replaced by people coming up from the ground that are learning this stuff.
Yes.
So there seems to be, eventually there will be the older generations that are kind of scoffing at this still, the ones that are at the highest rank or that are sort of taking up those positions where they really couldn't be bothered to worry about it because they're at the end of their career, or, you know,
Mhm.
they were raised at
The
a time.
white shirt, the brass, the whatever
Yeah,
you
and
would call
they're
them.
kind of they're being replaced by people that are probably like, maybe there is
Totally.
a reason. Maybe there is a good return on investment for really investing good emotional and mental well-being support for our members now, instead of having to try and, you know, rob from Peter to pay Paul later because we're 300 officers short, and now we're having to move people all around our zones in our province or our country because there's so many people off. So I do think, Megan, that there eventually over the coming decade or two we'll see a shifting of this where it will really start to ramp up in the right direction.
I think so too. Because you know what I think is funny about those 300 officers who are off work or whatever, right? I guarantee if they're doing any kind of treatment that's going to be helpful for them, this is the stuff they're talking about in treatment. Right, because you have to understand this stuff in order to heal. And so it's funny, I just this morning I was talking with a woman from Major Crimes in the RCMP out in BC. She's in Surrey or something, I think. And, you know, we were talking about some of this kind of stuff. And I was like, you know, what would it be like if you came into a detachment or your unit or whatever, and like everybody was talking the same language? Everybody understood about how this injury happens. Everybody sort of understood the importance of being able to regulate after a really stressful experience, or, you know, people could just talk freely about, you know, some of the reactions they were having. Like, what if that was just a normative thing? Can you even imagine? Like, it still seems so foreign, but that's the goal. That's the vision. And 100% that's the dream. That is absolutely possible. And it just, again, I hate the fact that we have to boil everything down to dollars and cents, but we do. But it is also, it's an economic, it's a smart economic thing to do as well, in just being the right thing to do to take care of people.
Yeah, it's economic for everybody. Everybody wins.
Everybody. That's right.
Right? Like
And I mean, it would lower the divorce rate. Our level of divorce rate for first responder military, it is so high. And I would bet my life that communication and those aspects are one of the biggest reason why.
Mhm.
You don't want to. I mean, how many people I've heard? I don't want to tell my spouse what I've seen today. I don't want to injure her or him. Which brings me to a different question. And after that, Jay, you can close it. I don't care. We'll bring her back. We'll bring her back. but
You're gonna be like, oh God, her again. Stop calling us. It's enough already.
So what would you think? What would happen if the public would know the amount of things we're facing?
Yeah.
Because I remember sitting in Tim Hortons, you know, late at night, or Tim Hortons would open for us only, just so we have our coffee at like 4 o'clock in the morning and we can just chat about what we've seen. And obviously there's nobody at that time, or there's someone who's passed out on the table. But what do you think would happen if the society would know? Because I think there's a lot of things that are covered. There's a lot of things that they're really pushed under the rug, like awful things, right? Like death, or it can be, you know, just look at the movie Sound of Freedom. They tried to just keep it silent for so long. So what do you think? What do you think would happen?
Another great question. You know, I have a colleague, his name is Duncan Shields. He's out in BC, and he shared this way of thinking about the uniformed services with me a number of years ago, which is that, you know, there's this civilian bubble that the majority of people out there are living under. And on top of this bubble are all of those people who are called to serve. And you're affording this protection from violence and, you know, terrorism and grief and all of these unimaginable things that most people don't know about, and frankly don't want to know about because it's too upsetting, right? I believe I'm actually involved in a project right now that's going to be broadcast in May. And one part of the project is to try to actually do just what you said, like try to actually educate or bring some awareness to the, you know, average person out there about what your typical service member is going through, whether that's police, fire, military, EMS, whatever, right? That, you know, like this isn't just about people turning up when, you know, a crime happens or an acute health situation occurs. It's all the other stuff and all the stuff around it and the amount of it. And I think if people had better understanding of that, maybe they would be more compassionate, and perhaps if they could be more compassionate and could be more, patient and understanding and aware, maybe that would also influence individuals being able to be that way with themselves. Because I've never met anybody who's going to be harder on themselves than, a cop or a firefighter or a soldier who's suffering with a post-traumatic stress injury. Like nobody can even come close to how self-critical they are, and maybe if there was more openness and willingness and understanding about, again, this unbelievable work that you all do, maybe we would be a little bit softer around the edges with one another. And I think that would be important.
Because you look at different countries, right? Like I will take Brazil for as an example, because it seats itself in the two most dangerous. They have the two most dangerous city in the world right now. So as of today, so violence is, the people are very aware of it, and they understand that they can leave their house and I remember living there. My friend would tell me, Canadian criminals are very polite. They ask you to leave your car when they add jacket, right? Here in Brazil, they're more honest. They kill you and they take your car, right? And my roommate had 2 scars on his chest, and he's like, well, that was 6 months ago. I got robbed walking down the street. That was 1 year ago. It's probably the same person who just cut him, took his wallet, and left. But if you look at how happy those community culture and so on and so forth are, I would say 10 times more than what we are here, despite the fact that they're fully aware of the level of danger that they live in, right? So are we doing a good thing by, sheltering our people, or a bad thing?
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I did my dissertation research on an idea called post-traumatic growth. I don't know if you two are aware of that. Yeah. And one of the populations that I looked at was children who were living in sort of war-torn areas. And so at that time, it was kind of the post-Bosnia, Herzegovina. So, kids who had been living around bombings happening and, the threat of death or destruction or whatever the case may be. And these were kids who were demonstrating all sorts of growth outcomes. And it was something about, we understand that this could happen. We understand that kind of life is precious and we have this time together that's not promised to us. And so therefore we're going to appreciate what we have. And we're going to recognize that we want to lean into the potential that this life has to offer us instead of zoning out from it. Right. And so again, there's that thing again, right? That there's something important about our ability to recognize fragility and actually be willing to encounter and engage with suffering as very important to how we take what we can out of this limited time that we have on this planet, and in fact, we are probably hurting ourselves the more we try to stay distant from it, or the more we try to insulate or protect ourselves from bad things from happening, right? Like that's not part of the human experience.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I agree.
100%. Dr. Megan, we're at 1:30 right now, which is pretty awesome.
And shut up, yeah.
I think we're going to have a lot of really incredible talks with you. It's really an honor to have you. You're a trauma healer. And for John and I, that's really important. And for the greater community, we need more people like you. I've been saying this, this will just kind of cap this off, I think. I've been saying this a little bit and I've written about it, and it's not my own thing, but it really sticks a good pin in this. And it's the old saying that a rising tide lifts all boats. Right? And so you're talking about the deeper thing here is that if we all come together as a community and recognize that we all need to recognize that this is real, work together as a team to make this more economical and more beneficial for everybody around us, we all reap the benefits and the rewards. And so I'm really looking forward to diving deep into BOS when you come back. And we have a litany of questions to continue to ask you. So thank you so much for being on today.
Well, thank you for having me. I have just thoroughly enjoyed this. I'll come back as many times as you'll have me. This was awesome. Thank you for asking such insightful questions and for being so open and willing to have me. And thank you for your gratitude. And I echo it back to you and to all who serve, right? I think these are really powerful conversations, and this is going to stick with me for the rest of the night and tomorrow, I'm sure.
Well, we'll see you again very soon. And hopefully anybody who's watching will see you again on the Raven Chronicles with Muninn and Huginn. Peace.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.